Okay, we are now live online. Good evening, everybody. Mark Pinto here at Phoenixville Public Library. Good to see so many of you on tonight for our presentation by Dr. Shauna Mcdonald. A little introduction for her. She is an associate professor at Villanova University, where she teaches courses in performance studies, gender, and communication. She's originally from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, which is how she first became interested in lighthouses. And for the last few years, she's been studying lighthouses as sites of cultural memory, with a focus on the gendered elements of those memories and how we share them. She's an artist, scholar, performer, and educator whose mission is to unearth, keep, and share stories. When we think of lighthouse keepers, we tend to think of them as men. So tonight, Shauna will share stories of the women who kept the lights and part of her own story as well. So we welcome now Shauna Mcdonald, and please save your comments and questions until the end of her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I would just ask, I suppose, Mark, if you notice anything not working properly, find a way to let me know. Sounds good. All right. So hello, it's so good to see all of your faces and your names here this evening. I'm very grateful to have this chance to share some of my research with all of you. Special thanks to Mark and to the Phoenixville Library for this opportunity. And welcome to all of you. Some of you, like I said, I know, and some of you I don't. And so let's dive in. I actually want to begin with a clip, if the technology gods will smile upon us, a clip from my solo show, which is called To Catch and to Keep, which I first performed in 2016. And, you know, as Mark said, I am a performer, so we'll start with that and then we'll dive right in. So I will share my screen. And here we go.
But what does it mean to keep? When I was a kid, I was fairly convinced that it meant to keep a watch. Until I was about, 13, I refused to sleep if I believed others were awake. If my parents had friends over or stayed out past my bedtime, I would lie awake, straining for a hint of their activity. I was afraid of missing something, unable to bear the thought that the details of the world might slip by me, unaware. I wanted to catch it all, to keep it. Every last midnight, every last word.
All right, and I will switch. Okay, so as Mark said, my name is Dr. Shauna Mcdonald. Some of you know me. I'm associate professor currently at Villanova University, but I'll actually be spending next year, at least, teaching at Cape Breton University, which is my alma mater, and of course where I'm from. So what I study is communication and performance studies. And I should have Liam do this part of the presentation, but I won't test him. So I study how we communicate with one another, right? With our whole bodies. But I'm also interested in how we communicate with non-human beings and with and through our environments. So many of my colleagues study things like organizational structure or media messaging, and those are very important things. But I'm interested in what we might call extraordinary communication. I've studied cyborgs, non-human beings, as I've said, and right now I'm really interested in how we study and how we communicate through place. So hence our focus tonight on lighthouses as places. One of the things that communication and cultural scholars pay attention to, though, is context. And so even though we will talk a lot about lighthouses tonight, and especially women who kept lighthouses, I also want to share a little bit more. And, you know, in the end, I hope to be able to illuminate some connections between lighthouses, women's work, and the political underpinnings of public memory. We'll have some fun along the way as well. So I'm going to continue sharing my screen just for a few minutes so you can see some of the lighthouses that I'm talking about and some of the info. So the plan this evening is to talk first about lighthouses in general, a little history lesson, and then moving into stories of Liz Keeper, which is also pretty historical, I have to say. And then we'll
Shauna, your audio is kind of garbled again.
Okay. Sure what to do about now. Let's see. Perhaps if you will bear with for one moment, we'll switch to a different headset. So give me just a moment.
Okay.
Sorry, one moment here. I apologize for this. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And how does it sound?
Sounds okay.
Okay. Well, it may be the best we can do for this evening, so hopefully you all can hear me. So, as I was saying, thank you, Mark, for letting me know. We'll talk about lighthouses in general, we'll talk about women as keepers, and then I want to spend a little bit of time at the end focused on why these stories matter and why we might pay attention to them as we move forward. So, starting off, what are lighthouses? And I know that sounds like a silly question, but not everyone has given it deep thought. So at its most basic, a lighthouse is a tower or a building with a light for guiding ships. Pretty simple. That's a definition from Dennis Noble. Lighthouses can be on land or in the water, which we'll talk more about later, but they're actually only one of the kinds of aids to navigation that exist. And so that category includes things like buoys and light ships, but I'm really focused on lighthouses. Of course, if lighthouses were simply buildings with lights on them, we probably wouldn't care that much about them, right? They're much more than that. They're cultural, right? They occupy dynamic cultural space. I think they're as cultural as they are brick and mortar or wood or whatever they happen to be made of. In fact, I really think about lighthouses as existing at the center of a lot of different aspects of our lives and communication. At the very least, they are media, transportation technologies, historical places, environmental bellwethers. They tell us about erosion. They're tourist destinations, of course, and sites of public memory. Lighthouses tell us about our nations and our regions, and they're symbols, of course, in life and in literature. We see them in a lot of our world. So before we dive into some of the stories of women, I did want to give you a little bit of a history lesson, so to speak, and talk about lighthouses more generally. So lighthouses have existed since ancient times, although of course, early on, they were most likely just fires on hilltops. The first known lighthouse structure, which you can see on this slide, is Egypt's Pharos of Alexandria, which was built around 280 BC. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now, this is obviously an artist's rendering of what we think it might have looked like based in some of the writings of ancient travelers and ancient historians. Now, this was, we think, 450 feet high, which means at the time that it stood, the only things taller, man-made, would have been the pyramids. And so this was a pretty massive structure. It's believed to have stood for 10 centuries, which might make it one of the longest standing lighthouses that has ever existed. But of course, it no longer stands today. The Romans had lighthouses. We mostly only have ruins. We lost a lot of those to history. And then the Middle Ages were quite literally dark. Lighthouse building completely stopped in what we think of as the Dark Ages. Building began again in the 11th century, mostly in Italy and in the Baltics. And so we sort of see this ramping up of trade and the need for lighthouses. By 1759, when England's infamous Eddystone Rock was first lit, building and nautical trade had improved so much that lighthouses were needed all over the world, and somewhat of a building boom began. The drawing here that you see is actually the third lighthouse on the spot of Eddystone. There were two prior to 1759, but they didn't survive storms for very much time. So this is considered to be the successful one. The first lighthouse in North America was, no surprise, in Boston Harbor. It was on Little Brewster Island. It was built in 1716, presumably by the British, and with the second following in French Louisbourg, about a half hour from where I grew up in Nova Scotia. So the bottom two photos are of, or not photos, the bottom two images, painting and a drawing, are of those two early lighthouses in North America. Incidentally, I just heard that the Boston Light, the Coast Guard is actually relinquishing its ownership of the Boston Light. So, you know, if you have a lot of money and you're interested in owning a lighthouse, that's the first in North America, so it would be pretty neat. Of course, fast forwarding just a little bit to the beginning of the US government, just to give you a sense of the growth of lighthouses and sort of how it started and where it ended up in North America, there were only about 12 lighthouses when, you know, after the Revolution, when the US government began. By 1820, there were 55 lighthouses. By 1852, 331. By the time the US Coast Guard, excuse me, took over in 1915, there were almost 1,400 lighthouses in the United States. So you can sort of tell the tale of expansion and just growth of population also through how lighthouses grew. Today, most lighthouses in the US remain under Coast Guard authority. At least the light part of the lighthouse does, but many lighthouses have, of course, fallen into disrepair. Some have been renovated and turned into tourist destinations or museums. So, you know, there are lots of various stages that we might find a lighthouse to be in. And some lighthouses are still aids to navigation. Contrary to popular belief, we still need them, right? Just because we have GPS doesn't mean that we can get rid of all of the lighthouses. So that's just a little bit of history. And all of that history matters, of course. But what I'm more interested in is how we know that history. I'm more interested in who kept that history, right? And more specifically tonight, who kept those lighthouses so that they could be maintained for us to have them in our present. So I'm going to unshare my screen now, and hopefully that helps with some of our technical difficulties as well. I'm going to try to unshare my screen. Let's see. There we go. And now you can maybe pay attention to me. All right, so I'm going to begin this next section with a short excerpt from the show, not a video itself, but just me. Early in my research, I met a keeper at the top of a tower. I entered the lanthorn room as he was chatting with other visitors, and he was a vision. An elderly chap in a uniform and cap, he soon regaled me with stories of work and the lighthouse. He was gentle and kind, and he even took my picture for me before I made my way back down the spiral staircase. Trust me, if you've ever imagined a lighthouse keeper, you've pictured this man. We've all pictured that man. As Mark was alluding to at the beginning, most of us tend to think that lighthouse keepers were all men. And I was no different. When I first started this research, I had no idea that women had kept lighthouses in the United States. I was a feminist researcher, I am a feminist researcher, but it just had never occurred to me that women would have been allowed to do this work in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it absolutely didn't occur to me that they would have maybe gotten paid for it. And so it's been a really interesting journey to learn that. And, you know, at first I was disappointed in myself, of course, like, of course, why couldn't women have done that? But pretty quickly I got very fascinated by their stories and really into this question of how did this happen, and why don't we know about it, right? Why don't we talk about it? So before I dive into some very specific stories of specific women, I want to sort of make a bit of a caveat. Because I'm located in the US, the northeast of the US, and because of available information, I've mostly focused on women lightkeepers in the US, or what eventually became the US. I wasn't sure until recently if Canadian women had kept lighthouses historically, and turns out, after some sleuthing, there were at least 3. So there were likely more than 3, because Canada has over 750 lighthouses. So I doubt that there were only 3 in the entire history. But there's a new research project for me. To give a little bit of that history, according to the Library and Archives of Canada blog, Mary Croft was keeper at Discovery Island in British Columbia from sometime around 1902 until 1934. Denise Arsenault kept the Bonami Light in New Brunswick from 1913 to 1927. And Maisie Adams kept the New London Lighthouse on Prince Edward Island from 1943 to 1959. So some of those are pretty local to where I grew up, which is kind of neat as well. All 3 of these Canadian women succeeded male relatives as keepers. They succeeded their fathers or their husbands. This was typically the way women became lighthouse keepers in the US as well. It was pretty rare for a woman to just be appointed a lighthouse keeper. Instead, she usually became one through illness or tragedy befalling her father or her husband, and potentially meaning there was no one else to do the work. A few women did manage to get appointed, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Much of what we know about women who kept the lights in the United States comes from, or it could be found in, various museums, but also the National Archives. And a lot of it, luckily for us, has been compiled into this book called Women Who Kept the Lights. And it's a book by Mary Louise and J. Candace Clifford, and lighthouse people know it well. I think it's in its 2nd or 3rd edition at this point. So a lot of my knowledge comes from this text as well. The first woman to keep a lighthouse in the United States, her name was Hannah Thomas. She kept Gurnett Point Light Station in Massachusetts from 1776 to 1786 officially. But she actually began doing the work when her husband, who was a general, went away to fight in the Revolutionary War. So she probably actually started as keeper before 1776. Her husband died of smallpox in Canada, and so she remained in charge in one way or another until around 1790, probably with the help of her sons as well. According to Clifford and Clifford, at least 122 women were officially appointed as keepers in the US from 1828 to 1905. So that's a relatively small period of time in history. Likely twice that many were appointed as assistant keepers, and many, many, many more women were likely keepers for short bursts of time, unofficially, when a husband or a father was ill or away or had to go to the mainland for something. Not only that, lighthouse keeping was a family affair, right? The lighthouse service was not stupid, and it knew that if it hired a married man, then it would get more than one employee. Of course, they only paid the keeper, but women, daughters, wives would likely have known how to do most of the lighthouse work, and would likely have done a lot of the lighthouse work while living there. In fact, just recently I was reading an article in Lighthouse Digest that featured a letter from 1950, and in it, women are asking, sort of petitioning the government, wives of lighthouse keepers are petitioning the government for compensation, because they're saying, we do this work too, and you're not paying us. So there's something really interesting about that to dig into as well. So with that background, I'd like to dig into some specific stories. I know that's part of the goal of this talk, of some women that I find really interesting and who have interesting stories, and then we'll go from there. So the first woman that people started asking me about, and people started saying, have you heard of, or has anyone ever told you about, was a woman named Kate Walker. And she probably came up all the time because of her connections to New Jersey, where I was doing my research, and New York. So who was Kate Walker? She was a German immigrant, and she immigrated to the US when she was young with a young son. So she was either widowed or single, and she was working at a boarding house in New Jersey. And John Walker, who was a lightkeeper at Sandy Hook Lighthouse, ate his meals at this boarding house. So one thing led to another, and he eventually taught her how to speak English and married her. And they moved to Sandy Hook, where he was the lighthouse keeper, and he taught her how to keep a lighthouse. Now, not long after they were married, John Walker was transferred to Robbins Reef Lighthouse in New York. So this would have been 1883. Interestingly, and this did happen a fair bit, she was hired directly as his assistant. So she was paid in this case. Now, Robbins Reef Light is in the bay or the harbor. It is not on land. And so Kate's world suddenly existed in an elevated, round structure in the middle of the water. She threatened to leave when they first got there, that she wouldn't live in this weird situation, but eventually she stayed and continued keeping the light with her husband. Unfortunately, only 3 years after they moved there, John Walker got pneumonia. And as he was being rowed away, presumably by a son, to the mainland to seek medical treatment, his last words to his wife were, "Mind the light, Kate." And mind it, she did for 30 years. So Kate remained the lighthouse keeper at Robbins Reef after her husband's death, which was that same day, I think. And her son, Jacob, who obviously grew up during those 30 years, helped her as well. Now, she was rumored to be no more than 100 pounds, and so some doubted that she could do the job. But she rang the fog bell. She saved over 50 people, rescued over 50 people, and kept an immaculate light and house. And so by all accounts, she was able to do the job quite well with a little bit of help. And so she is a really interesting woman, and obviously important in the region where I'm located right now, in our region where Phoenixville is. Now, the next woman I want to talk about is a woman who we don't know as much about, and who is not necessarily famous, and she's not in the Clifford's text. This woman is a woman I found out about through my research. So if you see behind me here, these pictures that I have, this larger one that doesn't quite look like a lighthouse, that's actually Hereford Inlet Lighthouse in Anglesey or Wildwood, New Jersey, for those of you who are local. And it's one of the lighthouses that I researched, and I learned about Laura there. So I'm going to start with a tiny excerpt from the show, and then I'll tell you all about Laura. Standing in the Hereford Inlet Lighthouse in Anglesey, New Jersey, staring at a line of framed, mostly black and white photographs, the known blurs to the unknown. I missed it before, but there it is. Laura Hedges, 1925 to 1926. Just to the right of William Hedges, 1919 to 1925. A drawing of a keeper's hat holds her place, her unofficial, official place in history. A cipher in a frame. In December of 1925, Laura wrote a letter to the superintendent of lighthouses, and in it she was asking for help. Her husband, William, had had a stroke 9 months before, and she was struggling now to look after the light and her husband. And she was asking the superintendent to find some sort of medical treatment for her husband, whether it be in a hospital or in an institution of some kind, because she just couldn't do it anymore. And she also asked in this letter to stay at the lighthouse as keeper. And one could imagine why. Compared to some lighthouses, this one would have been a fairly posh situation, but also it was her home, right? The only home she presumably knew. And so, in her own words, she says in the letter, I have substituted as keeper during his vacations on 2 different occasions, and I have also done the entire work during his illness. So to that point, she had been light keeper for 9 months, unofficially just keeping the light going while her husband was continuing to be ill. Unfortunately, William died before any of this could be sorted out, and Laura only got to stay at the lighthouse until sometime in February, which means she didn't really get her request to stay on as keeper at the lighthouse. But for a time, she was a keeper. Now, at the time of my research, there was no picture of Laura. The reason there was a drawing in the lighthouse was because they couldn't find a picture of her. And I actually based a lot of my solo show on the idea that we have all of these women that we can't uncover, that we don't have images for, that we don't have records of. But a few years later, I got an email from Steve Murray, who worked very closely for a long time at Hereford Inlet Lighthouse, wrote a book about it. He had found a picture of Laura, and I'll share that again at the end. But it was an amazing moment to open that email and have this thing that we thought was lost to history, and all of a sudden we have this story, but now we have an image that can go along with it. So that was pretty neat. The third woman that I want to more specifically talk about is Harriet Colfax. Now, Harriet is unique because she kept a lighthouse on the Great Lakes, and a lot of folks forget that the Great Lakes are enormous and so also need lighthouses. In fact, Michigan has the most lighthouses in the US. So Harriet's unique in that respect, but she's also unique in the sense that we believe she was appointed by her cousin, Schuyler Colfax, who those of you who are history buffs will recognize as then a member of Congress and eventually vice president to US President Grant. So she probably got this appointment through political means, but that doesn't mean that she couldn't do the job. So she proved quite capable. Harriet kept a light called Michigan City Light Station, which confusingly is in Indiana, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. She kept it from 1861 until 1904. So again, another woman who had a long tenure as a lighthouse keeper. Unlike the lighthouses we've talked about so far, she kept a light in the house, but also a beacon out on a pier. And so to get to the beacon, she would have to walk on an elevated walkway, which, if you can imagine, in the winter or even coming on winter on the Great Lakes, an elevated walkway, not exactly a pleasant set of things to have to do. And unfortunately, many times this elevated walkway got damaged by weather or ships actually hitting it, which seems like maybe the beacon wasn't working properly if that's the case. But from her log, we can get a sense of just a day where this might have been an issue. So this is from 1872, so she would have been keeping for a little while by now. September 29th, she says, wind blowing a westerly gale all day and still rising at 5 p.m. 4 vessels entered while the gale was at its height and ran against the elevated walk, breaking it in again. Went to the beacon tonight with considerable risk of life. And many of her logs, she kept really clear logs, and Clifford used them in their text. And it's kind of horrifying how many times this woman had to walk out in icy weather on broken elevated walkways to repair this beacon or to make sure the light was out for those who needed it. But she kept the light for 43 years. She never married. And she seems to have spent her life with another woman, this woman whose name is Anne C. Hartwell. So she could also be an important lighthouse figure for other reasons. She might be an interesting figure for LGBTQ history, but I would have to do more research, and everyone would have to do more research for us to figure out sort of the truth of that story. But it is interesting. Prior to being a lighthouse keeper, she was a teacher. So that probably explains why her logs and her records were so orderly and clear and useful for us all these years later. So there are, as I said, hundreds of women, and I can't tell you stories about all of them. So what I want to do now, again, if technology will allow, is show another clip from my solo performance where I do kind of a summary of some of these women and hit them in a little bit more of a rapid fire way. So hopefully you can get even more of the flavor of the lives that some of these women led. So I will share my screen. This one's a little bit longer, but hopefully worth it. So here we go.
(1817). Black Rock Light. This Catherine, Kate Moore, is 12. She trims the wicks with her father. He falls ill. She keeps the light. Saves 21 lives. Teaches herself to read. Keeps a garden. Carves duck decoys. Retires at 84. Lives to 105. 1856. Matinicus Rock Light. Abby Burgess is 17. Her father away, a month of storms. She saves her mother, her sister, and their hens, ushering all into the tower as a gale sweeps the rock. Eventually, she marries a lighthouse keeper's son, spends the rest of her life, or most of it, as an assistant keeper. 1869, Lime Rock Light. Ida Lewis is famous for her rescues. Ends up in Harper's Weekly. The president and vice president pay her visits. She started keeping at 15 when her father had a stroke. She would row her siblings to school in the same boat she used for her rescues. She's the most famous woman to have ever kept a light in the United States. Though fame didn't particularly suit her. Asked how she was able to save so many, she replied, "I don't know. I ain't particularly strong. The Lord Almighty just gives it to me when I need it. That's all." She died as a keeper, having kept the Lime Rock Light for over 50 years. 1906, another coast. Angel Island Light Station. Juliette Nichols watched in horror as the earth shook buildings to dust and set fire to factories across the bay. 3 months later, her fog signal broke. So she hit it with a hammer for 20 hours until the fog lifted. She and her stepmother, also a keeper, both retired in 1914. Elizabeth wrote books and cared for her mother. Laura kept a museum of the sea. And Emma received callers in the parlor. Harriet kept records of storms, wrecks, work, and apocalyptic comets. And Fanny mastered the radio telephone with nothing but the manual. They didn't consider themselves exceptional. Not really. And most have been recorded and lost, skipped over by the fickleness of the memory of the public.
So that was a few more of the women that have inspired me and that I've been interested in their stories. We can talk more about some of the specific ones if you want in a little bit. But I want to turn now to why we should care, right? And why we should remember these women who lived so long ago, why we should care about the lighthouses that they kept. And there are several reasons for that. So first off, the hundreds of women who worked officially and unofficially to keep lighthouses in North America contributed in a huge way to the technological, nautical, and economic creation of our societies. Without lighthouse keepers or without lighthouses, we likely wouldn't have many of the things that we have today. And these women had sort of a front row seat to a lot of that and were a big part of it. But so too did the slaves, freed and still enslaved, the indentured servants, the First Nations and Native American peoples, and others that had a hand in lighthouse history, but we know so very little about what that was. Their lives, and of course the lives of the men who were mostly working class men who kept lighthouses, their lives mattered, right? And the stories, another reason, right? The stories are fascinating in and of themselves. There's something about imagining a woman keeper dressed in a skirt, super knowledgeable and skillful, just going about her daily business. There's something idealistic about imagining that same woman rescuing sailors, right? So heroic. These stories or the fact that these women existed defies our expectations of the past, right? They defy our understanding of women in the past. They defy our understanding of work. And these stories really encourage us to take notice. But I would argue that we should tell these stories not just because the people mattered, and they did, and not just because the stories are good, and they are, but also because the stories we tell about the past and how we tell them matter a lot in the present and for the future. So rather than think about all of this as history, I've started to think about it as public memory. Public memory, in academic speak, is I should say public memories are rhetorically constructed recollections of a shared past that serve the present and future needs of individual communities. In other words, public memory is how we collectively tell stories about the past in ways that function and serve us in the present and the future. The ways we do that are never neutral. Our representations of the past are not about accuracy. They're about usefulness. So the stories that tend to get told are the ones that are useful to the people telling the story or to the time period where the story is being told. To give you an example that's not quite lighthouses, the most high-profile thing happening right now in relationship to this idea of public memory is, of course, all of the discussion about the Confederate statues in the US. Right? Many people don't realize that a lot of Confederate statues were actually constructed not right after the Civil War, but later in the Jim Crow era, right? And that matters, right? Why were they constructed then? Well, because they helped fuel the story of resegregating African Americans or of disenfranchising African Americans, right? So we saw a surge in the same kind of symbols and monuments also during the Civil Rights era. And of course, lo and behold, we're in another moment with some similar resonances, and we're having this conversation again. Though this time, the stories that we're telling are, I think, a little bit more nuanced, and it's harder right now to tell an entirely recuperative story of the South because our needs and our understandings as a culture have changed, right? So we have started to change how we tell that story. And there's something really interesting to me about living through this period where we're trying to wrestle with one another about how we're going to tell that story. So which stories we tell and how we tell them says a lot about what we value. And if we don't tell stories about women or working class people or people of color, then we should ask ourselves what that says about our values. I think it says at the very least that we don't value everyone equally and that we really never have valued everyone equally. To come back more specifically to lighthouses, Clifford and Clifford say, quote, any attempt to peer back into history and summon up the women who might have been keeping lighthouses at the turn of the 19th century is obscured by gaps in the historical records, gaps that reflect the lack of interest in recording the accomplishments of working men and women in that period. Many of the records we have, for example, this is me now, end quote. Many of the records that we have are of extraordinary events or storms or things that got picked up by the newspapers. The day-to-day, we don't have as many stories about until the Lighthouse Service started keeping better records. So we do have some lighthouse logs that are really helpful. So you see how this storytelling becomes a cycle, right? We keep what we value, which limits what we can access in the future. We tell stories about things that we value, which influences what we'll value in the future. And we tend to leave out things we don't know, but we also tend to leave out the bad parts, right? We want our stories to reflect well upon us. And so anytime a story doesn't seem to match with our understanding of the past, we might leave some stuff out or tell it in a particular kind of way so that that public memory, that history reflects the story that we want it to. We like lighthouse history. I like lighthouse history, obviously, but we like lighthouse history because it seems romantic. And of course it is, right? At times. We like it because it seems heroic, and it is at times. It seems unblemished, but it's not. It's also stories of dirt and loneliness and violence, corruption, definitely corruption, especially in the early years. And so the stories are much more complicated than what I'm able to share with you tonight. I want us to be able to tell more nuanced, more full stories. And that means including the negative and the positive. It means recognizing that there were slaves and Native Americans and immigrants who were a part of lighthouse success in the United States. But it also means that those same people were often harmed by lighthouse construction or discriminated against by those communities that were using the lighthouse. It also means recognizing that only some people can afford to care about lighthouses now, right? Or lighthouse history now in terms of the hierarchy of what people need. But it also means that we need to remember the women. I think that we should tell these stories of these women lighthouse keepers because they were central to building North America, because these stories remind us that women didn't begin working in the 1970s, right? Women have always worked, especially poor and working class women. Not always for pay, but have often worked to survive. And telling these stories really complicates our understanding of what it meant to be a woman prior to our modern women's rights movements. It also reminds us that we often tell stories in ways that leave a lot of things out and erase parts of our history. So part of my mission as we move forward is to continue telling stories with more nuance and to keep these stories alive. So to review, today we focused on lighthouses, on women who kept lighthouses, and on some of the politics of public memory. I hope you see some connections that you might not have seen before or learn some facts that you might not have known before. And the next time you see a lighthouse or read about one or see a lighthouse symbol, I would like you to think about the stories that those structures hold and maybe to be a little bit more critical about any single story, even the ones I've told you today, because this work of keeping and saving and caring, it feels like catching light beams in your bare hands. They will not be held, but once your fingertips are alight with their glow, you wish they'd stain them forever. You spend your life searching for the next flash on the horizon, reaching out to grab hold of the handle of a memory that just might pull you over the edge of the story. Even if you're left holding nothing but the scrap of a record, the shadow of a life etched in the corner of a note. But a scrap is enough to light a flame. And even empty pages can burn. 200 years of women shooting light across the universe, weaving a web of illumination for the world to sail through. I'm not about to let such wonders be extinguished. Not on my watch. Thank you.
Excellent, Shauna. Thank you. Anyone have questions for our host tonight? You can feel free to unmute yourself with the space bar on your keyboard or type a question into the chat.
While anyone is thinking, just real quick, I don't know if it'll let me go back. Yeah, there we go. That's Laura, the picture that we did not have and that we eventually found, and it is in such great shape. I don't know the dog's name, but that is Laura and the lighthouse dog. And then of course I have my sources. So happy to chat and answer any questions you may have.
Well, you know, I have a question. So I mean, throughout the presentation, I thought it was really fascinating to hear, you know, some women, you know, staying on as light keepers for, you know, 30, 40 years. And, you know, at least from the examples you said, it wasn't something they chose. They sort of took it on from like a father who took ill or a husband and took ill. So I was always wondering, you know, what was it that kept them there for so long? And just like a little side, you know, question, of course, you know, back in those times, women didn't have as many rights, and there was, you know, a lot more of an oppressive society to women. So my other question was, did they, like from the stories, did they ever view this lighthouse as, you know, a place of solitude or a place where they can say, you know, this is mine, and, you know, no one can come in here and threaten me or anything like that?
So I think yes. I certainly think someone like Harriet, who seemed to, the woman from Michigan, who aside from, you know, almost falling in the lake all the time, seemed to really relish her own space based in the stories that we have. And there definitely are stories of women who, well, some of the women I mentioned in the performed part, you know, one of them loved the ocean, right? Loved sea creatures, loved, you know, mollusks and clams and whatever she could find. And they actually created in her town, I don't know how long ago it maybe disappeared or if it still exists, but they created in her town like a little museum exhibit of her findings, right? So things that she found as she explored the area. And then a few others were writers. And so I can imagine that being a really, you know, productive space, right? A different kind of room of one's own, if you will. But I also think that some women, many women, you know, it was a roof over your head and it was enough money sort of to feed your kids. And if your kids could help you, especially if you were widowed and you had children, there are actually stories, I didn't share any of them, but and actually I don't have any specific stories necessarily, but in the history, it's known that some women were given lighthouse appointments and probably similar appointments after the Civil War because so many men had perished and so many women were left widowed. It was almost like a benefit or, you know, some kind of help for these women who mostly had kids and needed some way to make some income. But depending on who was in charge of the lighthouse board or the lighthouses, some were more amenable to women doing the job than others. And I think other times it was like, no one wants this job, right? It's in the middle of nowhere on a rocky cliff. so you can have it, right? And so I think there are a lot of reasons why women stayed. But, you know, many of them did, like sort of in their reflections toward the end of their lives, talk about growing to really love the lighthouse and really love the life that they led there. So I think it's a mixed bag, but that's a really good question because, you know, I could imagine it being a relief for some women who didn't want to have to perform a certain kind of femininity or, you know, be sort of just a wife, so to speak. If they wanted something different, then that gave them a chance to do that. Sorry, that was a long answer, but you knew that it would be.
No, I loved it.
You've been in my classes. Oh, I have a raised hand. Chris G.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris.
Oh, hi.
Question about, you were talking about Harriet Colfax. First of all, brave woman. If any of you have ever been to the Great Lakes during a storm, it's a really lonely job. I can't imagine the solitude and, the danger of it too.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned a friend of hers that she had. Her name was, what was her name again?
Her name is Anne, A-N-N-E.
Yeah.
Middle initial C and last name Hartwell.
Okay. I have a reason to ask that because that's a family name.
Ah, there you go. So my
Could
understanding
be a relative.
Yeah, exactly. So she
Somewhere.
also was a teacher. This Miss Hartwell was also a teacher, and from what they can gather, she actually followed Harriet Colfax to Michigan. They weren't from, or to Indiana. They weren't from the Great Lakes region. They're from the Northeast. And, it seems to me that if they spent their lives together and, that Anne followed Harriet, that there is something more there than, either they were just very, very good best friends, which could be the case, or something more. But either way, it's a wonderful sort of sketch of a different way of being a woman and a different way of doing the job, right? It's really fascinating, and she left us such probably, well, who knows, right? We don't know how self-aware anyone is when they're keeping records, but the fact that her records are in the National Archives, I think is really, really powerful.
What else are you going to do if you're watching a light? I mean, other than the work.
Yep. But I mean, I think, no, that's true. And it's a great question. And I think what's interesting is we sort of forget sometimes that, like, most of these people would not have been educated, right? You wouldn't be, unless you were a political appointee,
Right.
You might have had a little bit of grade school education, but most of these folks, like, you would not choose to keep a lighthouse if you were super wealthy, for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, these were working class people. And so, even keeping logs would have been tricky for some, right? And they wouldn't have had as much detail or, spelling or legible writing. Whereas, we have some of these instances where people really took pride in that. So it's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just looking at the chat to make sure there's.
Yeah, there are a couple of comments in the chat there for you.
Thanks, people. I appreciate your chats, Amy and Carrie. Any other, and it doesn't have to be a question either, if someone has a story they want to share. I mean, I know we're getting close to time, but if anyone has a favorite lighthouse or has a memory at a lighthouse or any of those kinds of things are, good parts of the conversation.
What's your favorite lighthouse, Shauna?
Well, so that's an easy one to answer, but it feels sometimes like a cop-out, but I'll tell the story. This is also in the longer version of the show, but, and I'm going to embarrass my mom who is watching, and probably my dad, but they, okay, so back up. So my mom grew up near a lighthouse. It's called the Low Point Lighthouse. It's actually the lighthouse that I showed on my thank you slide. And it's in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And my father's father was hired by, actually, I should know the answer to who hired him. I don't, but he was hired as an assistant to the keepers at that lighthouse in the 60s. So my father's family ended up moving to where my mother's family lived. And my parents were 12 or 13 at the time, or got to know each other, and by the time they were 12 or 13, they started dating. So I have to love that lighthouse, in part because it's partially responsible for my existence, but also it's a beautiful lighthouse and it's home, and it's not yet a museum, or there's a group working to keep it restored. So I'm hoping to work a little bit with that group as I move forward. But that would be my favorite. My favorite New Jersey lighthouse is the Hereford Inlet Lighthouse, which is this one behind me here. Oh, that's the Low Point Lighthouse right there. Haha. So that's my favorite, with a ferry in the background. I forgot that was there. And then Hereford Inlet is my favorite New Jersey lighthouse because it's just so different. I also got to go to a lighthouse in Greece once. That was really cool. I try to go wherever I am in the world. I try to see a lighthouse at least.
Yep, same here, same here.
Well, what's your favorite then?
Oh, don't really have one.
Okay, that's fair.
I vacationed at the shore as a kid, so I'm kind of partial to Old Barney.
It's great.
Yeah.
Scary, but great. It's going to fall in the water if they don't do something soon, but yeah. That's the thing about lighthouses in a way. As I've been doing this work, I've learned, and in some ways the women too, it's hard to pick a favorite, right? It's like choosing among your children. You can't really do that. And each lighthouse has such a unique history, even ones that were built based on the same plans or built by the same builders. You know, there are so many things, so many threads you can pull from each lighthouse in terms of the history of the keepers, the families, ghost stories, technology stuff, you know, rescues, all of that. There are whole books and articles written about lighthouse pets, you know, so animals that just showed up one day at the lighthouse and decided to stay, or animals that lighthouse keepers adopted. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff there.
Any more questions,
Mom.
comments?
So I have one question, Shauna. Would there have been women lighthouse keepers outside of the continental Americas, in Europe, for example?
So this is something that I'm curious about as well. I don't know the answer to that. It seems impossible to me that there weren't, you know, more women who did the job, maybe not officially. I think one of the things that became a sticking point, or you know, a block to women becoming keepers is, of course, different countries had different rules. And I, like, for instance, I think in Canada, at least for a certain part of Canada's history, it wasn't legal for a woman to be the main lighthouse keeper. So I think there are probably lots of countries where that's the case. But again, there are all kinds of stories from history of women posing as men, women, you know, ending up doing men's work, and people kind of just either turn a blind eye or think, you know, this woman knows what she's doing, so we're just going to kind of leave well enough alone. So I'm sure there are some. I don't know how good the records are. Like I said, my next step, I think, is to, you know, because I am Canadian and because of my new position in Nova Scotia, my next step is probably to do some deeper dive into the Canadian women, and then hopefully someday to branch out further into the rest of the world. But certainly there are lighthouses everywhere, or everywhere where there's seafaring, and so I just cannot imagine that there weren't more women. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I guess that's it. Shauna, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And like I was telling Mark earlier, doing a deep dive into this again has really, you know, because the original research is a couple of years old, but I'm still working on this topic, and so it's really been reinvigorating for me, and having an audience is really wonderful. And so, you know, I hope that you keep coming to these lectures, which are such a great thing that the library is doing in our bizarre COVID world. Oh, you're muted, Mark. Mark, you're muted. Oh no.
Mark, we can't hear you.
So nobody heard anything that I just said. Great, okay. I do terrible with this mute, unmute thing. Basically, just thank everyone for joining us tonight and to let you know that this presentation will be available on the library's YouTube channel in a couple of days. A lot of
Thanks,
kudos
Shauna.
still coming in on the chat there.
Well, again, I want to thank you all for taking some time in your evening. I know we're all busy, and I have such a meeting of the worlds going on. I have some Villanova people, people from the library, people that I know from back home. So it's been really neat to get to share with all of you at the same time, which normally wouldn't happen, right? Because normally these things would be in a physical proximity and not, you know, folks in Nova Scotia wouldn't be here. So it's really neat that this was made possible. So thank you.
Have a good one.
Okay, good night, everybody. Thanks again, Shauna. Take care.
Wonderful job. It was great to see you.
Thanks for coming, Liam. Bye.